In Victorian London, there were several respectable ways to make a fortune. You could inherit it, you could marry it, or if you were sufficiently imaginative, you could simply invent it. In the 1850s, two poor young men from the Thames foreshore discovered they could manufacture ancient artefacts, bury them in Thames mud, and sell them as genuine. Their names were William Smith and Charles Eaton. To London they became Billy and Charley. Dealers bought their relics, collectors paid for them, and even respected antiquarians were fooled. Among their creations was a medieval-looking fish with a tiny man inside it. Welcome back. Grab your tea. This is the story of the Shadwell Shams.
Before Billy Smith became a forger, he was what the Victorians called a mudlark. It sounds almost charming now. It was not charming at all. The Thames, in the middle of the 19th century, was one of London's great working rivers. Filthy, industrial, and at low tide, strangely generous to anyone poor enough to search its exposed foreshore for something worth selling. Coal, rope, scraps of metal, broken pottery, and every now and then, something genuinely old. Billy Smith began searching the riverbank around 1844, reportedly when he was about 10 years old. The mud had a peculiar habit of preserving things London's streets had lost generations earlier. Medieval badges, old coins, fragments of lives nobody living could quite remember. And there were collectors, dealers, and comfortably wealthy gentlemen willing to pay good money for such things. Billy learned the trade quickly, where to search, what to look for, and perhaps most importantly, what people wanted to buy. Because a genuine ancient object was worth money, but finding one was a matter of luck. Making one was an entirely different proposition altogether.
By the 1850s, Billy Smith was no longer the small boy picking through the mud. He was a working man, and he had been joined by Charles Eaton, Charley, another poorly educated Londoner with no place whatsoever in the learned archaeological circles of the day. Neither man was an antiquarian, neither had studied at a university, neither spent his evenings poring over ancient manuscripts. What they had instead was rather more practical. They knew what people wanted to buy, and more importantly, they knew how much those people wanted to believe it was genuine. Around 1857, the pair decided to remove the single most inconvenient variable from their business: luck. Rather than waiting for the Thames to occasionally surrender something interesting, they would simply make something interesting themselves. Medallions, badges, small figures, religious objects, coins. Curious pieces of metal that appeared, at first glance, to belong somewhere deep in London's forgotten medieval past. But making something look old was only half the trick. It had to look as though it had been found, and that required something no respectable workshop could easily manufacture: the mud of the Thames. Billy and Charlie set up their operation in a workshop on Rosemary Street, near the Tower of London, and got to work. They carved moulds, they melted lead, and they began casting their own antiquities: medallions, pilgrim badges, coins, small figures, religious objects. They borrowed forms from genuine antiquities they had seen in the Thames, then added their own increasingly imaginative creations. One of them was particularly memorable: a fish with a tiny human figure inside it. To modernise, the objects are wonderfully strange. But there was a problem. A freshly cast piece of lead looks exactly like what it is. Freshly cast. It looks new. And nothing about new was going to convince anyone that an object had just emerged from the medieval past. So Billy and Charlie gave their creations a little help. They treated the metal with acid to make it appear older, then painted Thames mud onto the surface. A newly made object was transformed into something that appeared to have spent centuries underground. But even that wasn't enough, because an ancient object isn't merely old, it has to have a history, and Billy and Charlie were about to give theirs one. They claimed the object had been discovered during the construction of the new docks at Shadwell. The Thames, supposedly, had surrendered another collection of forgotten relics. And suddenly their buyers weren't simply purchasing curious pieces of lead, they were buying a discovery. In 1857 alone, Billy and Charlie reportedly sold around 1,100 objects for about £200, roughly £19,000 in today's money, according to the London Museum. And that was when their little workshop stopped being merely a workshop. It became a factory for the past. By the middle of the 19th century, Victorian London had developed an interesting fascination with antiquity, and the timing of Billy and Charlie's operation could hardly have been better. London was being torn apart and rebuilt. Dockyards were expanding. Old buildings were disappearing. The Thames foreshore was constantly being disturbed by construction, and genuine medieval objects were turning up in the mud. That was the perfect environment for a fraud. A strange object appears, someone says it was found beneath London soil, and why wouldn't you believe them? The Thames had already produced so many fascinating discoveries that another one hardly seemed impossible. Some respected antiquarians accepted Billy and Charlie's objects as genuine. Among them was Charles Roach Smith, an important antiquarian and co-founder of the British Archaeological Association. He saw similarities between the supposed discoveries and the unusual medieval badges that were genuinely being found along the Thames. And that was precisely the problem. The real discoveries made the fakes believable. But not everyone was convinced. One man in particular began looking rather more carefully. His name was Henry Sire Cumming. Henry Sire Cumming, unlike some of his colleagues, began looking at the objects rather more carefully. At first, the problems were small. The inscriptions were strange. Letters seemed to have been copied without any real understanding of what they meant. Some combinations of characters were simply nonsense. Then there were the dates. Several supposedly medieval objects carried dates written in Arabic numerals, a detail that did not fit comfortably with the periods they claimed to represent. The more Cumming looked, the more the objects began to reveal themselves. Billy and Charlie had learned to copy the appearance of antiquity, but they had not understood the world they were imitating. They knew what an ancient object was supposed to look like. They didn't know enough to make it behave like one. And now Cumming had a very simple question. If these objects had really been discovered at Shadwell docks, where were the people who had found them? So he went searching. He spoke to the labourers actually working at the docks. Surely someone had seen the discoveries. Surely someone knew Billy and Charlie. But the answers were remarkably unhelpful. Nobody knew them. Nobody had seen the objects. And nobody could remember the discoveries supposedly emerging from the mud. The mystery was no longer simply whether the objects were genuine. It was becoming a much more uncomfortable question. Where had they actually come from? Eventually, suspicion wasn't enough. If Billy and Charlie were really making the objects, someone needed to find the workshop where they were doing it. And what followed was one of the more ingenious pieces of Victorian detective work. According to accounts preserved by the Society of Antiquaries, a sewer scavenger, known as a tosher, was persuaded to make his way into Billy and Charlie's workshop. He went in quietly, and he came back out carrying something far more useful than a confession. Moulds. Moulds used to cast the supposedly ancient objects.
Suddenly, the mystery looked considerably less mysterious. The Shadwell antiquities were not emerging from London's medieval past. They were being made in a workshop near Tower Hill, cast in lead, and then disguised with acid and Thames mud. The ancient past, it turned out, had a surprisingly modern workshop. But finding the moulds did not make the controversy disappear. By then, the objects had already travelled far beyond Billy and Charlie's little workshop. Dealers had sold them, collectors had bought them, and respected antiquarians had defended them as genuine. The argument had grown into something much larger than the two men who had started it. It had become a question of reputation. If Billy and Charlie were frauds, then what did that make the experts who had believed them? And perhaps more uncomfortable still, what did it say about the people who had wanted to believe?
But Billy and Charlie did not quietly retire when their workshop was exposed. They adapted. London was becoming difficult. Their name was known, their reputation was deteriorating, and the people who had once been willing to buy their discoveries were becoming considerably more cautious. So Billy and Charlie went elsewhere. Guildford, Portsmouth, and other towns across southern England, where the name Billy and Charlie did not yet carry quite the same warning. The discoveries continued. New objects appeared, new stories accompanied them, and, remarkably, people continued to buy. The pair found themselves in court more than once over the following years, but proving exactly who had manufactured the objects, and, more importantly, proving what Billy and Charlie had actually known about them, was another matter. In 1867, a court at Aylesbury found insufficient evidence to establish the necessary wrongdoing. Billy and Charlie walked free. For a little while longer, the business continued. But there was a problem they could no longer manufacture their way out of. Their reputation had caught up with them. By the end of the 1860s, the market for their particular brand of manufactured antiquity was drying up. The Thames had supplied them with mud. The collectors had supplied them with money. And now, finally, neither was enough to keep the business alive. By 1869, demand had almost entirely collapsed. Henry Sire Cumming, the very man who had first grown suspicious of Billy and Charlie's objects, bought 7 of them for almost nothing. Not because he believed they were valuable antiquities. He bought them because they were evidence, warnings in a sense, of one of the strangest archaeological deceptions Victorian London had produced. Charlie Eaton died in 1870, in roughly the same riverside part of London where the story had begun. His death certificate described him, rather quietly, as a riverside labourer. There is something almost fitting about that. After years spent manufacturing pieces of the distant past, the official record remembered him simply as a man who worked beside the river. Billy Smith outlived him. There are scattered later references to him attempting to sell more objects here and there. And then, eventually, he disappears from the historical record. No grand confession, no dramatic final courtroom speech, no magnificent fortune hidden away somewhere. Just a Londoner who had discovered, through observation and considerable nerve, that people would pay good money for something that merely looked old. And yet there is something rather delightful about what happened next. Billy and Charlie's creations survived. Museums acquired them, collectors preserved them, and eventually scholars began studying them, not as medieval antiquities, but as evidence of something far more genuinely Victorian, a remarkably inventive fraud. The very objects Billy and Charlie's had passed off as ancient eventually became historical in their own right. The fake became real history. Not medieval history, Victorian history. Two poorly educated Londoners had looked at a city obsessed with its own past and realised something their better educated customers had briefly forgotten. An expert may know what history is supposed to look like. A collector may know what history is worth. But the man selling it knows something rather more useful. He knows how badly you want to believe him. And that is the story of the Shadwell Shams, Billy and Charlie, and the fish with the tiny man inside it. Until next time. And if anyone ever offers you a genuine medieval relic, freshly pulled from the Thames mud, ask where they found it.